Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I find myself talking over the music a little bit. I apologize if I seem to be screaming. But anyway, welcome to a Wednesday edition of the Virtual Center. Today is the first day of November in the year 2017. We have made it into the beginning of yet another month. It is a pleasure to be with you on this, our third day of broadcast, which is our regular schedule, but it has seemed like over the last several weeks that on one end or the other, somebody, it seems to me, is causing us to not do programs at least one of the days of our broadcast week. So it looks like this week is going to be the exception. We're going to make it. Hopefully, we'll be able to make it for the full 2 hours today. I do hope so. I want to thank you for your continued support of the program and for your continued support of Bob and Agnes and the folks at the Head On Radio Network. If you'd like to get on our program today and get your thoughts and your ideas, your concerns, your hopes, fears, whatever they might be, related to the news of the day, if you'd like to come on the air, we would love to have you. Just through Skype, just call Bob Kincaid Horn, H-O-R-N, on Skype. That'll take you into the studio, and Bob will get you on the air, and we'll take it from there. We would love to hear from you. I mean that. I definitely would. If you're a little bit uncomfortable or reluctant about going on the air, but at the same time, you've really got something to say that you believe that other people would benefit from. First of all, let me tell you that undoubtedly you're right. The very nature of the people who listen to this program have something to say, and make listening to them worthwhile. So if you are inclined to come on the air, please feel free to do it. I think it'd be a shame to deny all the people listening to the program, to deny access to your ideas, your thoughts, or whatever. But if you are uncomfortable about coming on the air, and I can appreciate that, then by all means, if you put your thoughts down in an email and send them to me, I'll do the very best I can to fill in for you and, to the best of my ability, represent your thoughts, your interests, your concerns, your ideas, whatever it is that you express in your email. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906, all one word, single space, lowercase, at gmail.com. waobrien906@gmail.com. I also encourage you to check out our Facebook page. If you do that, if you're a regular user of Facebook, you'll know how easy it is. Just type in on your browser Facebook.com, and you will be into the homepage of Facebook. And on that homepage, there's a search box at the top. And if you type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you'll be into our Facebook page. Early this morning, before I went to class, left the house about 7:30 to go to class this morning for an 8 o'clock class. And before I did, I posted the link to the article on the lost children of Cham in this past weekend's New York Times. Now you have to look for it, because for the first 3 days of this week, it remained on the homepage of the New York Times. Well, it's off that now. But if you go to your browser and just type in the lost children of Cham, T-A-U-M, of course, it's spelled, you will get you will be into that article, and it's a really good read. And the reason I put it on our Facebook page is in case people haven't had the opportunity to read it and wouldn't think about going through the New York Times to get it. The link is on our Facebook page, and if you click on that, you will be into that article, and I don't think that you'll be disappointed at all. And again, the other things that I put on there most recently are articles that are related to yesterday's program and will be continued in today's program. I'd like to go back and spend a portion of our program, at least today, on some of the things we talked about yesterday, because I think we really got into it. And to be very honest with you, the last 15 minutes of the program, if you were with us, you recall that Bob Kincaid joined us, and we chatted for a while on this whole question of education and what it is and what it isn't. I think was the way the conversation went, and it was very, very helpful. It seems to me, I found it informative, and it was the kind of exchange that really does contribute to people's understanding of oftentimes, some very complex, complicated issues. I guess what I'm saying is that I am appreciative at this point in my life. It's a little bit late, but I have become very appreciative of just how complicated the whole topic, the whole subject of education really is. And so, it is with that lead-in that I would like to return and maybe do a little bit of review at the beginning and then see where this particular topic takes us. I, in class this morning, had an experience that ended up in one of the places, and of course at the end of class, the first thing I thought of was one of the education articles that we had been talking about or discussing on yesterday's program, because it seemed that like what we got into in class was a perfect example of what that particular article suggests and demonstrates. So with that, then, let me begin by reminding you of the two education pieces that really were the subject of yesterday's program, and I'd like to kind of go back and touch base on those again. And kind of, if people weren't with us yesterday, then this will be new stuff. And for those that were with us yesterday, it'll be review. And hopefully, you will find, even if it is review, you'll find it beneficial. I do hope so. I think it's very, very important and very significant. The first article is one which appeared in the New York Review of Books. In fact, it appears in the current edition of the New York Review of Books. If you go on your browser to NY Review, REVIEW, that will take you to the homepage of the New York Review of Books. And you will get an outline or a table of contents, if you will, of the current edition of the New York Review. And the article that you're looking for is an article by Marilynne Robinson. And Marilynne is spelled a little bit differently than we usually associate Marilyn, which ends in an N. In this case, Marilynne Robinson's first name is, let me get my printed copies here so I can make sure I'm correct. It's Marilyn with an extra N, a second N and an E at the end. So it's Marilynne, Marilynne Robinson. The title of the article is What Are We Doing Here? It is an article in which Marilynne Robinson sets out to defend and argue for the importance and the significance of the humanities in higher education. She is obviously responding to heavy pressure in our contemporary society to make education much more useful, as people would define it, much more related to the kinds of jobs, the kinds of professions that people are most likely to be going in today. The argument is then, the argument in favor of changing curriculum in education, especially in higher education, is the fact that with so much of higher education continuing to focus on the humanities, people are convincing themselves that that makes our college educations impractical and therefore not really worth the time or especially the money. And as state governments have reduced their allocations to higher education in their own states, colleges and universities have been forced, I believe, to replace the revenue that used to come from the states with tuition increases. And the result of that is that higher education increasingly seems to be becoming the property almost exclusively of the well-to-do, which it was at the very beginning. In a sense, what makes this whole issue so significant in one area, it seems to me, is the fact that we are inadvertently returning to a time when higher education was the exclusive prerogative of the elite, of the upper class, the children of the wealthy. And the average person is finding it more and more difficult to afford to go to college or university. And institutions have tried to find various ways, come up with gimmicks, to help students afford a college education. We still have Pell Grants. We still have federal loan programs in which qualification for eligibility for these loans is principally driven by need. And in today's society, it appears more and more people are in need, especially since the cost of tuition has continued to escalate. The cost of textbooks has continued to escalate. And the result is that when you combine these negatives, these disincentives to attend college, when you combine them with the increasing flow, if you will, of anti-higher education perspective, as more and more people begin to question the legitimacy of higher education, they're not only questioning its cost, but they're questioning its usefulness. And many people are actually beginning to argue that higher education is not a good deal. And so what they are in effect doing is reinforcing the inclination of a lot of people that ought to be going to college, that they really ought to rethink that. The fact of the matter is, they're making a horrendous mistake for a lot of reasons. And one of the major ones is the theme, or the thesis, if you will, of Marilynne Robinson's article, What Are We Doing Here? And again, she will have a book coming out in the near future by the same name. And I think after you read this article, you might be inclined to take a look at the book, when it comes out. Although I'll be very honest with you, I can't imagine that the book is going to have much more that's valuable than is in this article. This is one of the best pieces of information on higher education I've read in a long time. And of course, I need to preface that or justify that by explaining or admitting that indeed I do agree with Marilynne Robinson's concerns. I am a big fan of humanities education, of so-called liberal education. And again, please recall that by liberal education, I don't mean political liberalism. I mean the traditional idea that education is the ticket, is the route toward exercising and experiencing to the maximum the benefits and values of freedom, of individual freedom. So again, I really do recommend this article. And the link to it, you can go directly into the New York Review of Books on your browser, on your computer, and get it for yourself. But I also put the link on our Facebook page. So if you scroll down our Facebook page, this past weekend I put the link to Marilynne Robinson's article on there. So all you need to do is click it, and you will be into the article, and you can kind of read it for yourself. In this article, Marilynne Robinson addresses the substance, the benefits of the humanities. And basically her theme, which is actually the same kind of things that I've said numerous times on this program, I believe more than anything else, the benefits of a quality of a good education are basically that it teaches people how to be human. I don't think the mere fact that we are alive and that our bodies move, even though our mind doesn't, that essentially constitutes human life. It seems to me human life is and needs to be defined by respect for that life, by respect for the dignity of every human being, irrespective of ethnic background, race, religion, whatever, the things that divide us. The fact of the matter is, as human beings, it seems to me, that in itself makes human life a valuable thing. And for complete and total appreciation of that life, humanities education, I believe, is essential. Because as Marilynne Robinson said, it's the key to making one human. I totally agree with that perspective. And so on that score alone, I would defend the value of humanities education. Let me share with you a couple of the specifics from Marilynne Robinson's article. The first thing I'd like to share with you is a paragraph that we looked at yesterday. And let me share it with you again. It's near the beginning of her article. There is a great deal of questioning now of the value of the humanities, Robinson says. Those aptly named disciplines that make us consider what human beings have been and are and will be. There is growing pressure on our great universities, she explains, to equip our young to be what the Fabians used to call brain workers. They are to be skilled laborers in the new economy, intellectually nimble enough to meet its needs, which we know will change constantly and unpredictably. Robinson then compares the products, the human products, of this effort to train people for positive contributions in the workplace to robots, which many of these graduates will be competing with for jobs. Respect for what man or what an individual knows and can do, she suggests, has no place in this market-driven, skills-based agenda. Her concern is that in training individuals for positive contributions to the workplace, you are doing that at the expense of a necessary education required to make human beings human and to give them the kinds of insights and understandings they need to fully understand and appreciate the value of life itself. Not only will they appreciate it, but they will learn to respect it. They will come to dignify it. And if we are to resolve many of the problems in today's world, I think, and I'm kind of guessing that Marilyn Robinson would agree with me, I think education is the ticket, is the key to resolving many of those problems. Because the fact of the matter is, if we really genuinely as a culture fully respected the value of life, which we claim to, especially those of us who profess to be Christians, that we appreciate and value human life, I would suggest to you that if we really meant that, if we really believed that, then we wouldn't be looking for and trying to find ways to justify taking life. And if you think about it, we have come up with some absolutely horrendous logic, thinking, rationalization, that has justified the taking of human lives in massive numbers for religious reasons, for ethnic reasons, for financial reasons, for cultural reasons. We have found throughout our history justifications and excuses for doing horrendous things to other people, which, if we really respected their humanity, we would never do. It seems to me that this is the principal benefit of a humanities education. If I have a concern with higher education, it's the fact that I don't believe the way we are teaching the humanities is accomplishing the ends that we ought to be accomplishing. By objectifying the disciplines within the humanities, and I'll get to those in a moment. But the way you teach them, the way you ask or require students to encounter them, to engage them, to address them, is going to determine in the long run what people get out of the engagement or the experience. And my feeling is that if you objectify the humanities for test purposes, by asking people to memorize names and dates and events, rather than appreciate and understand the human aspects of those names, dates, and events, then you are missing a tremendous opportunity. You are losing the value of the quality and potential that humanities education offers. For the most part, when people talk about the humanities, they're talking about what in higher education we usually refer to as humanities and social sciences, the various disciplines that we usually lump together under the heading humanities. Many colleges and universities, most of them I would say, separate humanities from social sciences. And traditionally, the focus on the disciplines tends to be more information-driven than anything else. And I think we do that at the cost of losing much of the potential of humanities education that Marilyn Robinson is teaching about. She is obviously talking about a way to educate, a way to teach the humanities, which I feel, unfortunately, too many of our institutions don't appreciate. And I think that what we end up doing is allowing the burdens or the challenges of the actual classroom experience dictate how we teach. One of the concerns that I have, for example, in my teaching experience this semester is the very size of the class. I have 85 people in my class. What that effectively does is dictate how you teach the class, because it eliminates a lot of alternative ways of teaching. It pretty much discourages almost totally discussion. because most students are very reluctant to raise their hands and speak out in class anyway. And when that class consists of more than 80 people, I would argue that 95% of the students in that class never in their life would raise their hand and say anything in front of a group that large. So by definition, whatever you might do in teaching a particular subject as a way to get students to engage material is eliminated. And you're almost left with straight lecture as the only viable way to teach material in a class that size. What that means is you really need to put time into the lectures so that you can accomplish as many of the things you would like to do if you could teach in different ways, if you could get discussions going. Let me give you just an example of what's been going on this past week in my own class. We have an exam due Friday. It's take-home. Students have been given 4 essays. And of that 4, they have to answer 2. And they're to turn them in on Friday. And so what I wanted to do, was give students the opportunity to talk to each other about these questions without my being there. Because I'm fully aware that with the instructor in the room, students are going to be less willing to expose themselves, to expose their position or their opinion on certain issues. So what I made up my mind that I would try to do is divide the class into groups and give them the assignment. And we did this Monday and we did it again today. Since I divided the exam into 2 groups of questions, 2 in the first group and 2 in the second, and I asked students to choose 1 question from each group. What I did on Monday was focus on the 2 questions in Group A, and I asked them to focus on those. And then I broke them into groups and left the room and gave them 15 or 20 minutes of time. Now, how many took advantage of this, I don't know. But that was the intent, is for me to slip out of the way and give students an opportunity, since they were all wrestling with the same questions, just share with each other. This is the way I look at that question. This is what I think it's asking us. These are the kinds of things I think the question requires in order to answer it, etc. That's what I wanted students to be exposed to, the way their own classmates were looking at the subject. And then today I did it with Group B questions, the second 2 questions. One of the questions was on the politics of the 1790s, principally the administrations of President George Washington. And basically the question that I asked them, which I made up myself, but I really do believe it's a question that gets at what I wanted to get at. And basically what I said is, it's one thing to lay out on paper the structure of a government, in other words, write a constitution. It's one thing to put together a government on paper which lays out exactly how the government will function, how it'll work, how it will relate to students, to citizens, how citizens will relate to it, etc. What I basically said in the question is, it's one thing to sketch out a scheme for how a society should be governed. It's quite another thing to actually get it to work, to actually put it into practice and make it work. And so what I ask students to do, if they choose that question, is to take that on. What are the differences between laying out the scheme and actually putting it on wheels, putting it into practice? And of course, during the course of presenting the material, the major issue I addressed was the emergence of 2 parties, the idea of a party system, political parties. Never mentioned in the Constitution. In fact, everything at the time to discourage the emergence of parties was done. The assumption was, the belief was, that in a Republican popular government like this one, there really is no room for alternative points of view. Since this is the people's government and the people have direct input into the decisions, then it ought to be possible for all citizens to get on board and support their government in trying to implement decisions that the people themselves made. Well, the fact of that is, and Madison makes it very clear in the Federalist Papers, that it sounds great, but the reality is it denies the realities of human nature. And Madison points out in Federalist number 10, for example, that people will naturally disagree and be at odds with other people on the most insignificant as well as significant issues. And since he says factions or parties, if you will, are sown into the nature of man, then you can't set up a government that tries to discourage the creation of parties. In fact, what you have to do is accept the obvious, that they will form, and somehow your government must be able to accommodate them. And that seems to me to be the principal issue that separates the substance of the 1790s from the theory going into it, which is the scheme as laid out in the Constitution of the United States. I've asked students to take that question on. And then as a second part of that same question, I asked them to speak to the degree to which the personality and the trust that most citizens had in George Washington as their first president. To what extent was any success that the nation experienced in the 1790s directly attributable to the presence of President George Washington? In other words, what role did his personality and the trust and faith people had in him play in getting the system to work in the 1790s? And I've asked students to deal with that. So that was the discussion this morning. But the point I'm trying to make, and I don't want to lose my train of thought here totally, the fact of the matter is when you have 80, 85 people in a class, it really eliminates a lot of the options, the teaching options, and really reduces you almost to straight lecture, the straight presentation of information with little feedback from students. And I don't necessarily believe that that's very helpful. And so my concern is that Marilynne Robinson is operating on the assumption that higher education knows what it's doing. Unfortunately, I don't believe in many cases that that's true. Therefore, I think that even though curriculum tends to be organized around humanities, around the different disciplines that constitutes the humanities, I don't really believe that the real benefits of humanities education are necessarily coming through the way they ought to come through. But there's no question, and we talked about this in yesterday's program, so I won't go back again. But if you look at the entire history of education in this nation from the beginning, beginning with Benjamin Franklin's argument for making education more practical, more useful, this debate between education to get a job versus education for human development has been an ongoing one throughout much of the nation's history. And at certain times, one seems to be, in the driver's seat. One perspective seems to be in the driver's seat. Later on, another one. The other one seems to overwhelm it. Right now, the humanities, at least in theory, are in the driver's seat. Much of higher education continues to be organized around a foundation of humanities education. Many programs, academic programs, many curricula, if you will, are built around and upon humanities classes. For example, the institution that I taught at for a number of years, Concord University here in southern West Virginia, requires all students, no matter what majors, what their major might be, requires all students to meet the requirements of what they call a general education component. All students are required to take a minimum number of courses that in Marilyn Robinson's framework would constitute humanities education. So many history classes, so many economics classes, so many literature classes, perhaps a philosophy class, a required class in music or art or theater, something in the area of what we call the arts. And every student who graduates from this institution is required to have that foundation with a minimum number of credit hours, so that when they graduate with a 4-year degree, after having completed, it used to be 128 hours and they've reduced it to 120, that a substantial portion, probably 40% of the total number of credit hours, needs to be devoted to the humanities. By definition, then, that makes Concord University a humanities-driven, or the more common term, a liberal arts college. Because the so-called liberal arts are the foundation of every curriculum that that institution offers. But then you get into the question of how those classes are taught. And it seemed to me, if students are going to get a complete total appreciation for humanity itself, for the dignity of human life, if you will, respect for other people, respect for the rights and freedoms of other people, respect for the differences that seem sometimes to divide people, recognizing that the most important thing are the things that unite them. And the principal thing that unites them is the fact that they are all human beings. And that means, in the ideal world of humanities education, that they are entitled to a certain degree of dignity and respect from other people. So if you look at the disciplines, the subjects that make up the humanities, if you will, and I'm looking at humanities in a broadest area here, then the one thing that characterizes the humanities is that every subject within it is people-oriented. Political science is how people organize themselves in order to govern themselves. History is the story of this people learning to live together, prosper together, and flourish together as a society, as a nation. Sociology focuses on the interactions of different groups of people, in theory, with the idea that by coming into contact with people who have differences with you, different religions, different races, different creeds, different nationalities, etc., the integration of these different groups produces a commonality that constitutes the dominant culture of this particular society or this particular civilization. Psychology focuses on human beings and the way mind and body cooperate, the way people make decisions. What is it that causes people to act and behave in the ways they do? And to what extent can we arrive at a definition of something we call normal behavior? And are there strategies that we can use to to give people the opportunity to go through the process whereby they become normal, if you will, and are able to function with other people in their particular culture and other people in their society. Philosophy classes are the thoughts, philosophies, and ideologies which contribute to and help form the foundation of what this particular group of people, this particular society, bases truth on. Ways it finds, or it has decided to pursue truth, find it and test it and establish it. The arts, music, theater, painting, art, sculpture, architecture, all of these things, it seems to me, are reflections of individuals in this society as they express themselves. And there are many people who believe that the arts are a window into the soul of a society. So in a sense, by asking students or requiring students to take a random number of classes in these various different disciplines, the assumption is that students will complete this experience with a real appreciation for the beauty and the dignity of humanity. I guess the trick is to come together and agree on the best strategies for making that happen. I think everybody who's in the business of education thinks they have found it. And I'm not, I include myself in that group. But this, then, is Marilynne Robinson's thesis. And her argument is that if we give in to this pressure to make education more useful, more practical, more beneficial in learning skills, work-related skills, in order to get jobs and build careers, then we're doing so at the expense of something that's much more important, which is the full development of these people as people. And the absence of that component in the way we educate our people, all of our people, can have dire consequences on our society as it is able to function, or as it might become dysfunctional down the road. In her article, Marilynne Robinson puts a tremendous emphasis on the writing of de Tocqueville and his 2-volume book, Democracy in America. And from de Tocqueville's introduction, she includes this paragraph and builds a significant amount of her essay on the substance of this paragraph. So let me share it with you from de Tocqueville. From the moment when the exercise of intelligence had become a source of strength and wealth, each step in the development of science, each new area of knowledge, each fresh idea had to be viewed as a seed of power placed within people's grasp. Poetry, eloquence, memory, the beauty of wit, the fires of imagination, the depth of thought, all these gifts which heaven shares out by chance, turn to the advantage of democracy. And even when they belong to the enemies of democracy, they still promoted its cause by highlighting the natural grandeur of man. Its victories spread, therefore, alongside those of civilization and education. Literature was an arsenal open to all, where the weak and the poor could always find arms. Unquote. What Marilynne Robinson is telling us, and what she goes to de Tocqueville for evidence of, is the fact that from the very beginning, those who knew, those who could understand, appreciated the degree to which humanities education and democracy go hand in hand. The whole idea of government by the many, for the many, necessitates the kind of people, the kinds of citizens who appreciate human life, who respect it, and are willing to worship it, and respect it, and condone it, and support it, and look at their fellow man as human beings and treat them that way. The whole idea of the golden rule of treating others like you would like to be treated, like you would like to have them treat you, is critical in this. And so what Marilynne Robinson is telling us is that our way of life in politics, the way we organize our society, the way we have chosen to govern it, is absolutely dependent upon an education grounded in the humanities. The founders at the time in the 18th century, the founders used to talk all the time about public virtue, civic virtue, and that the nature of the government that they had created required a virtuous citizenry. Virtue is, in essence, respect for other human beings and the rights of other human beings. And I think if you look at it that way, you can see the connection that Marilynne Robinson makes. Let me say, as while we're talking about Marilynne Robinson's article, that there are things about it that I would raise questions on. There are two that I would mention specifically here. The first is one we've already dealt with, and that is the way the humanities are taught. It seems to me that she is overlooking that factor. She is assuming that the mere existence of humanities subjects equates to a humanities education. I would suggest to you that that's not true. Unfortunately, I would suggest to you that that's not true. The way these subjects are taught directly affects what students get out of them. If you don't put at the front end an emphasis on the fact that these subjects, sociology, psychology, political science, geography, economics, every one of those subjects is a social science. It deals with one aspect or another of people and how people live together and how successful they are in their ability to live together. If you don't drive the way you teach the course with those considerations, it's really impossible to expect students to get them on the other end. I would suggest to you that Marilynne Robinson assumes an outcome which I would argue she cannot assume. Her feeling is that if the humanities subjects are in the curriculum, if they are major parts of the overall courses of study, then that means that the humanities are winning. I would suggest to you that that's not true. You can teach humanities classes the same way you teach automobile mechanics or any other technical subject as training. If you take a psychology class and you present it from the perspective of asking students to memorize the names of particular psychologists and this particular school of psychology that they belong to, and your exams at the end are focusing on students getting good grades or bad grades depending on how well they've memorized that information. If you've turned your psychology class or your sociology class or your government class or your history class into classes generated or driven principally by memorization of isolated random pieces of information that don't seem to connect one to another, then you've lost the benefits of the humanities. Your education is no different than a course I took in how to tune up an engine or how to repair an air conditioner or how to wire a house or how to plumb a house or any of the other pieces of technical information that directly lead to employment. That's the ultimate goal of those who want to downplay or de-emphasize humanities education. We cannot allow ourselves to teach these subjects in ways which make the full benefits of humanities education unreachable or impossible. And unfortunately, too many of our people do that. One of the things that used to bother me in the years that I taught at Concord, for example, is we had many of our introductory humanities courses, our literature classes, our art classes, our music classes, our history classes, our geography classes, our government classes, taught by people, maybe full-time people, but most often part-time people, who had no idea that the class they were teaching was part of a general education component in the education of these students. They didn't know that the classes they were teaching were part of the general education program at the institution. Not only that, they had no idea what the general education program at the institution even was, let alone how the class they're teaching fit into it. So consequently, they could come into class and teach a full-blown humanities class and get almost none of the benefits. Never touch on many of the bases or the reasons why that particular class was part of the general education program in the first place. Because they never knew that there was a general education program, nor did they know how the class they're teaching fit into it. Used to frustrate me tremendously that was so prevalent. And I will say, in terms of politics, sometimes it made your life politically untenable. As director of the college's off-campus program here, I took it upon myself to introduce these considerations to all of our instructors. I even designed and developed a program which I called the Adjunct Academy. And the purpose of it was to take all of our part-time instructors and bring them to sessions on weekends and in those sessions be exposed to the humanities, to what a humanities education was, to what general education was about, to why the classes they were teaching fit in to the overall general education program, what that meant in terms of what they were supposed to be teaching and what kinds of issues and topics they were expected to introduce to students to. And the powers that be on the main campus killed it. Their argument was that I was basically injecting myself into areas which was their prerogative. They were the academic divisions. They were the professionals in the field. And it wasn't fair for me to teach psychology and sociology and economics teachers how to teach what they teach. And so the Adjunct Academy came and went very quickly. It lasted 2 years, I believe. And I actually had people on the main campus say to me, why don't you just give this stuff up and just go back to teaching history where you belong and leave the rest of us alone? So I think I feel very, very strongly about this. That's why I so recommend Marilynne Robinson's article. And there's one other aspect of that article that I think is significant. And it's one that I'd like to address when we come back from break. But let me tell you essentially what it is now and then address it when we come back in 4 or 5 minutes after we take a break. The issue is that Marilynne Robinson's article seems premised on the idea that the only students who can benefit from this kind of humanities education and instruction are the few, are traditional college students. The fact of the matter is, if the full benefits of the humanities are going to be felt throughout the society, then all society citizens have to be exposed to them, not just those who are going to college. What we need to do is find ways to make sure that every citizen is introduced and required to engage many of these issues and many of these topics. Because all of our citizens constitute the elements of the society that needs to benefit from humanities education. If you only present it to a minority, then the full benefits of the humanities instruction can never be realized. And so that's a topic that I'd like to consider when we come back from break. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I don't think there's any question that civic responsibility is pretty much what we're into in today's program, at least so far. We're going to pause and take a 5-minute break. Give people an opportunity to get up and walk around. It'll give you an opportunity, if you haven't already done it, to dial up or go to our Virtual Center webpage and click on Marilynne Robinson's article and kind of be looking at it when we come back so that you'll know exactly where we are and where we're getting some of the things that we're introducing. We'll be right back after a 5-minute break. I know that Bob has queued up some music for us, and I know all of us will appreciate it. Thank you. We'll be right back. Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to our second hour on this Wednesday afternoon. Today is the first day of November in the year 2017. If you are just joining us, it is a pleasure to be with you, and I want to thank you for joining us. If you've been with us through the first hour and are still with us, I want to thank you for staying here with us. I hope that we can justify your faith in this program to hold your attention for the better part of another hour. I hope we can do that. I'll do the very best I can to try. We would love to hear from you. If you would like to weigh in on this topic, which we've been talking about, the Marilynne Robinson article on humanities education specifically, if you'd like to weigh in on any facet of this, by all means, we'd love to hear from you. Just contact through Bob Kincaid, Bob Kincaid Horn, Horn, on Skype. That'll get you into the studio, and Bob will get you on the air, and we'll be able to chat and give other people an opportunity to hear your thoughts, hear about your ideas. And I'm pretty positive that if you go to the trouble of doing this, that what you have to say is something that other people will be grateful for your willingness to share it with them. If you'd like to put your ideas in an email and send them to me, or send me an email and react however you want, then by all means feel free to do that. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. Again, lowercase, single word, WAOBRIEN 906, O'Brien, W.A. O'Brien, 906@gmail.com. And I do invite you to visit our Facebook page. Just go to Facebook and in the search box type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution. You will have access to our Facebook page, access to the links to some of the articles that we're talking about. More specifically, the link that we've been referring to in our first hour is to a New York Review of Books articles in the current edition of the New York Review by Marilynne Robinson, entitled "What Are We Doing Here?" I also remind you that early this morning I put on the Facebook page the link to the article on the lost children of Chum, and which we talked about yesterday and made reference to in our first hour today. And actually, I kind of want to go back and make reference to it again, although I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but I think it warrants a comment or two. I wanted to first, before we get into it, I told Bob in a message on Facebook, a message on Skype, while the music was playing during our break, that music, that kind of jazz, if you will, reminded me of a time in my wayward youth, so to speak. I grew up in Boston, and one of the realities of life growing up in Boston, of course, they used to refer to it as Irish, as lace curtain Catholic, which was a lot of kinky things went on behind curtains, but nobody could ever see them. And one of the things that Massachusetts had, of course, when I was young, was a 21-year-old drinking age. So when myself and my friends, when we turned 18, many of us believed that we ought to be able to drink beer or liquor or what we wanted to drink. And you couldn't do it until you were 21 in Massachusetts. On the other hand, New York had an 18-year-old drinking age. So consequently, more than a few times, 3 or 4 of us would pile into a car if one of us happened to be able to afford the gasoline in a car, and drive the 3.5 hours or 4 hours from Boston to New York. And we'd share the costs of a room and spend the weekend in New York City. And we could go in and out of bars and enjoy a beer or whatever, and it was legal. One of the places we went to, just on Times Square, was a jazz club called the Metropole. And when I was listening to the music that Bob played in the interlude, I was thinking back to that experience. I can remember sitting there, drinking beer on a Saturday afternoon with a couple of friends, listening to some of the finest jazz music I ever heard in my life. I've never heard anything like it. And I remember one of the particular people that was playing there, who has since died, was a jazz musician named Louis Napoleon. And I kind of think, as I recall, that he played jazz piano and used to make that keyboard just absolutely jump off the floor, as I recall. Gene Krupa, the drummer, used to perform regularly at the Metropole. it's an experience that I hadn't thought of for years, and Bob's selection of music reminded me of that today. And I told him in a chat that when we came back, I was going to share that story about going out of state, driving 4 hours to legally be able to drink beer, and do it in a place like the Metropole, which was even more important, I think. Back to our subject. We were talking about Marilynne Robinson's article on humanities education, and the two concerns that I have with Marilynne Robinson's approach to the humanities education as laid out in her article. The first one was that she tends to assume that if the subjects are there and are being taught, then the very positive outcomes she speaks to in her article related to humanities education are happening. And the fact of the matter is, I think that that's an assumption she can't afford to make, because I think she would appreciate, as well as I appreciate, the fact that in too many cases, these classes are being taught in ways which make the outcomes she praises impossible. The courses are being objectified, and they are being nitpicked and presenting the information as information rather than students getting the kind of appreciation of the subject matter that gives them an appreciation of the humanities in general. So that's one of the concerns that I have with Marilynne Robinson's article. The other one is the assumption as to who gets it or who can benefit from it. I think one of the major assumptions of our entire approach to education, higher education, as well as K through 12 education, is the assumption that only a minority of our students have the ability to get it. That in reality, we require all of our students to attend. But for the most part, our instructors foam at the mouth at the thought that there are going to be students in their class who can really understand and appreciate what they're teaching. And there's an inclination on the part of instructors, and I would say this advisedly because I'm one and have been one, and that is you naturally teach to those students, which means you cease teaching the other students in the class who really need to be taught. Oftentimes don't get the attention they need because the instructor is focusing on the 10 or 15 students in a class of 25 or 30 that are really with the subject. And so the fact of the matter is, the kind of humanities education and the outcomes that she speaks to and extends praise for are outcomes that all students, all citizens need to have the opportunity to embrace. And that's hardly the case in higher education today. I've talked before. We have myself and a couple of colleagues have put together a program, and we've literally been banging our heads against brick walls trying to get higher education institutions in this area to pick up on it and give us a chance to prove we're right. And that is teaching the kinds of academic skills in ways, trusting the subject matter, the disciplines, in principally humanities areas that will give students the opportunity to engage the sources, engage the material. And only when they engage it do the kind of outcomes, the kinds of results that all of us want, that Marilynne Robinson wants, can happen. My feeling is that if you believe that most students can't benefit from this, then the profession itself denies students access to it. And these kinds of very positive approaches to education are reserved exclusively for the few, for those that can handle it, those who we believe going in, that we assume can benefit from it. On the other hand, there are so many students that we have concluded ahead of time that can't do it, can't appreciate it, that we don't even give them the opportunity to try. Therefore, throughout our nation, there are significant numbers, tens of thousands, I would argue, who would be able to benefit from higher education taught this way, that educators refuse to deliver on. Educators refuse to admit these people into the academy. Our goal is, because of the quality of the way they live their lives, most of them are working and supporting families and the rest of it, to expect them to quit jobs, put their entire families at risk in order to go back to school and get this on a main campus is not even feasible. So our approach is to use technology and deliver this approach to education to them. What we're talking about is educating those people who heretofore higher education has refused to serve. We can't get any institutions willing to give it a try and give us the opportunity to prove that we know what we're talking about. And we kind of get together in as a group and kind of ask each other questions. Can you understand why nobody wants to hear what we're saying? Can you understand why nobody will give us an opportunity? What is there in our message that's wrong? Why are so few willing to give us a hearing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? What we're talking about is a major change, because we're talking about college education for the many, not just the few. That violates basic assumptions that have been made from the very beginning about education. And if I have a concern about Marilyn Robinson's article, it's the fact that I think her approach is pretty much driven by the same assumptions, that there are only certain people that can benefit from this, certain people that can get it, and that you're wasting your time trying to deliver this kind of an education to the masses. I don't believe you are. I believe the kind of skills we're talking about are skills that everybody can master. If people can think and make decisions and evaluate choices, then they can do this. And these are things that everybody has to do and everybody can do. Maybe not to the level of expertise that others can. There are differences, obviously, between people and their abilities and skills and talents. We know that. But the fact of the matter is, to a degree, everybody can do it. And when you recognize the fact that these very academic skills, intellectual skills, what we call cognitive skills, are indeed the very same skills that are most in demand in today's technological workplace, that pretty much eliminates reasons for not doing it. It's really worth giving it a try. If you want to create an educated workforce, I would suggest to you this is the way to do it. Anyway, that's pretty much Marilyn Robinson's article from the New York Review of Books. I encourage you to go on our Virtual Center Facebook page, get the link to it on the posting that's there, click on it, and read this article. Let me step away from Marilyn Robinson's article a little bit and talk about the results, about the outcomes. All of us were mesmerized, I'm sure, as I was, by the horrendous news last night about the terrorism that befell New York City, Manhattan, late yesterday afternoon. An individual in a rented truck drove onto a bike path, stayed on it for a full mile, and ran down every cyclist, every pedestrian that he could find, and ended up killing 8 people and severely wounding 11, I believe. And then the perpetrator was, as you know, was shot by a New York City policeman and arrested and is in the hospital and apparently will survive. And that's giving a lot of people hope because they're going to have an opportunity to ask questions of this individual. That usually doesn't happen. The people that do these things usually take their own life, as we saw in the Las Vegas situation from a few weeks ago. I ask you to think about the mentality that would do something like this. All of us struggle trying to understand, trying to comprehend how people could do this to other people. The fact of the matter is, with the kind of education that Marilynne Robinson's talking about, if that was universally applied, then chances are society would be left with very few people who would even consider doing a thing like this. Those of us who are horrified by this kind of brutality of people against other people, human beings against other human beings. The mere fact that we're horrified by it and can't even conceive of how there are people who would do this kind of thing. These are the people, I would argue, that have already been exposed to many of the things that Marilynne Robinson is talking about, that she sees as being so valuable in higher education. Which brings me back to the link on the Facebook page today on Sunday's article on the lost children of CHUM. We spent a little bit of time on that article yesterday. Bob Kincaid and I chatted about that article before we went on the air yesterday. And what we were specifically talking about was a mentality that would allow an entire nation, an entire society comprised of one universal religion in that particular country, which is the Catholic Church, to perpetrate such inhumanity on infant children, to the point that the woman who conducted the research and dug up this story, I use that word advisedly, identified what she believes to be 796 such children who were died and buried without ceremony, without baptism, without even a name, let alone a headstone and a gravesite. Their little bodies wrapped and stored in an abandoned storage tank, never to be found or heard from again. The church involved is the Roman Catholic Church. We've been exposed in recent years to the abuse by priests of young boys. Horrified by it. The church has been reeling for several years. It seems to me that when you look at this particular story told in reference to the lost children of CHUM, one begins to see an element of inhumanity that might even be more severe. I don't know whether you can establish categories of more and most when you're talking about this kind of thing. But it seems to me, as we look back throughout history, even our modern history, we begin to see evidence, example after example, of people doing horrible things to other people, which suggests that there's an awful lot we're not doing. And if we are doing it, we're not doing it well enough, because it's not having an effect, at least the kind of effect we would hope for. In my class, we're entering the third unit of the semester as we approach the last month of this class. And what we're specifically looking at here is the emergence of sectionalism in America and the gaps that developed between the Southern slave system and the free labor system that the rest of the country was organized upon, and trying to get a handle on exactly what was it that made the sectional differences so huge, so immense, that it seemingly led the nation into a civil war which costs hundreds of thousands of lives and pitted brother against brother, state against state, American against American. And that directly leads us to the institution of slavery. For all the years that I've taught, along with everybody else who teaches it, I've struggled to try to appreciate the totality and the realities of slavery, and I really reached the conclusion that there's no way I can do that. There's no way any of us can do it. And I even made the point in class this morning that even the African Americans in our class would have difficulty trying to appreciate the full impact and the full thrust of the slave system. The fact of the matter is, it speaks to the kind of inhumanity that Marilynne Robinson promises we can get if we begin to educate our young people in the proper way. I would suggest that the institution of slavery and the willingness of so many to defend it would suggest the degree of need that still exists in this country for this kind of humanities-driven education and this kind of attitude in the way people look at other people. I put the link to the Lost Children of Choom on the Facebook page today because I wanted the students in my class to have the opportunity to read it as well. And the basic argument I was using, or the presentation I was making this morning, was that in reading this article and trying to understand Irish culture, Catholic theology, the behavior of the Roman Catholic Church, the willingness of the Irish government to go along with this practice, which seemed to produce such blatantly inhuman results as to lead to the death and virtual non-existence of almost 800 young children. In wrestling with this story and trying to understand that, we are also getting our mind into a frame of reference where we try to understand the institution of slavery as well. We can read the literature of the slaves. We can recreate the songs and the hymns that many of these slaves sang to each other, with each other, as they worked together in the fields. And we can try to appreciate the plight of the slave in that way. But at the same time, I think we also have to own up to our own inability to fully comprehend, to fully understand what in man would condone an institution that would treat millions of people as non-people. In fact, to condone a frame of government which expressly defined them as property rather than people. And to reach a compromise at the Constitutional Convention which effectively concluded that all the people there could agree that when it came to blacks, all we were dealing was 3/5 of a person. 60% of a person, 66%. This in a nation which so many people profess to be a Christian nation. But then again, if you look at the history of Christianity, you find things that are even worse, or at least as bad. Let me recommend for you a read to you, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because it would really get us off the subject. Maybe in a future program we can address this. But one of the regular conservative columnists, he is rather conservative, on the New York Times staff is Ross Douthat. Let me spell his last name for you just to make sure that I've got it correct. Douthat is D-O-U-T-H-A-T. Ross Douthat. In this morning's New York Times, Ross Douthat has an article, November 1st, an op-ed piece in the opinion section of the New York Times entitled, "Who Won the Reformation?" And since this is the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, of Martin Luther tacking the 95 Theses on the door of the church, which basically began the movement which split the world of Christianity into Catholicism and Protestantism. And from then on, we saw all the denominations within Protestantism emerge. And the question that Mr. Douthat is asking is, who won? Did the Catholics win? Did the Protestants win? His answer to that question, which is what his article is about, is that in reality, in the course of a struggle between this faith and that faith, between this brand of Christianity and that brand of Christianity, what really won was secularism. The need to push religion totally out of people's political lives. And we know the reactions that continues to have. Douthat's conclusion is the dominance of secularism, which really was the result of the Protestant Reformation rather than a victory for Protestants or Catholics, produced its own form of religion, namely, in contemporary demands to worship the market or to worship the authoritarian power of the state. And to make one's commitment to the all-powerful power of the state or the all-powerful pocket and power and draw of the market equivalent in demands of loyalty from citizens to everything that religion offered. And once you totally got religion out of people's day-to-day lives, at least as far as political structure was concerned, you basically left the road clear for some of the most inhumane events that actually made the Reformation itself look like a game. The Holocaust, the institution of slavery, ethnic wars, genocide, the efforts of people to totally obliterate and annihilate whole peoples. And somehow we found a way to rationalize this. I would suggest to you that the history of the world, especially the modern world, speaks louder than anything else to the importance of Marilynne Robinson's article. History alone makes reading of her article imperative, it seems to me. I encourage you to take advantage of an opportunity, the kind of opportunity that doesn't come along all that often in our lives, to experience something that really moves us, that may really begin to provide some of the answers to questions that many of us have concluded do not have answers. I mean that very sincerely. Because we have done some horrible things. Let me share with you one paragraph from Rolf Douthart's article. He talks about as the real religious groups begin to kick back and forth the question as to who won the Reformation. Douthart says, meanwhile, while this is going on, the secular intelligentsia can only really celebrate the Reformation's anniversary in instrumental terms. From the perspective of official liberalism, most of the Reformation fathers were fundamentalists and bigots, even worse in some cases than were the Catholics. They opposed. So for Lutheran and Calvinist rebellions to be worth memorializing, it must be because of their means to secularize the ends, to liberate people, the individual, from the shackles of religious authority, which allowed scientific inquiry and capitalism to flourish, made secular politics possible, ultimately permitted liberalism to triumph. In a sense, he says, this 500th anniversary of the Reformation is a good time to be a little bit harsh about the world that we live in and take for granted. Neither Protestants nor Catholics won that war between the faiths. The instrumentalists did. The Machiavellians, the Westerners, who wanted political and economic life to be set free from the meddling of troublesome priests and turbulent prophets. And so 500 years after Luther threaded his 95 tweets together and pinned them to a door in Wittenberg, it's their propaganda that deserves the most scrutiny, the most skepticism, the strongest doubts. At the heart of that propaganda is a simple story about authority and the individual. First, this story goes, Protestantism replaced the authority of the church with the authority of the Bible. Then, once it became clear that nobody could agree on what the Bible meant, the authority of conscience became preeminent. And from there, we naturally entered into the age of liberty, democracy, and human rights. The problem with that story is that, like all propaganda, it edits selectively and treats the experience of various fortunate groups as the measure of a much messier reality. The Reformation and its wars did indeed diminish religious authority, secularize politics, and allow certain kinds of individualism to flourish. But they also empowered the great new gods of modernity, the almighty market and the centralizing state, which claimed their own kind of authority over everyday life, making the divided churches into handmaidens or scapegoats, and using Christianity as an excuse for plunder rather than a restraining counterforce to worldly lust. That's some pretty powerful writing, man, let me tell you. Those are direct quotations from this article in today's New York Times by Ross Douthat entitled, Who Won the Reformation? I think it's well worth a read because it kind of suggests that the world we inherited, the world that is free, at least on the surface, of religious authority in over people's everyday lives, has been replaced by ideological commitment, almost worship, of what Ronald Reagan called the miracle of the market, the miracle of the market, and the power of the centralized state. It seems to me that what we're seeing, example after example of, are people who have taken advantage of the priorities of the situation and have produced changes which result in some pretty inhuman behavior toward other people. Think of the debate on health care. Think of the numbers of people who are willing to support health care reform, which would basically deprive tens of thousands, if not millions of people from access to health care of any kind because they can't afford to buy it. We have turned health care, the good health of our fellow citizens, into a commodity driven by the rules that govern the market. And we have even convinced ourselves that adherence to that market, to the principles which drive that market, are more important than how we treat each other, and justify denying necessary care and good health to fellow citizens because they don't have access to enough money. And we're comfortable with this. I would suggest that Marilyn Robinson probably believes, if you were to pin her down, that we've really got many of our priorities screwed up. I think I would agree. A second article that we did, we have a little bit of time left in our program. We've got about 12 minutes left in today's program. The second article that we touched upon yesterday was also on higher education. It was an article by Frank Bruni, and it was in yesterday's New York Times, Tuesday's New York Times. And basically, the title of this article let me be accurate here. Too many colleges flunk Trump 101. And basically, what Frank Bruni is writing about are those conservative people who have been overlooked, ignored, or denied. These are the people that responded last November by electing Donald Trump as President of the United States. And it's causing our colleges and universities to rethink what they're doing. We spent most of our time yesterday on this particular article talking about the fact that our institutions of higher education tend to see the world and its priorities differently than do the surrounding communities which they're in. Consequently, the college people vote differently than the people in the counties around them. And I tried to spend some time on that particular issue yesterday. But Bruni's point is that there seems to be an effort in higher education to recruit as potential students go after enrollment by these people who elected President Trump. And in order to do that and do it equitably, the thinking is that our colleges have to become a little bit less liberal than they are, because these people are conservatives. They elected Donald Trump. And so the solution to this problem of making our institutions more ideologically balanced and fair is to hire more conservative faculty in order to serve and teach these more conservative students. There's a real issue here. And it's not conservatism. It's the degree to which uneducated people think at all. The question that I'm raising is it justified to look at the people, the base, that elected Donald Trump President of the United States and conclude that these are conservatives who got together and stood up as one and confounded the nation by electing Donald Trump? I would suggest to you that labeling somebody a conservative basically seems to assume that these people know something. The fact that they are presumably uneducated or largely uneducated doesn't mean that conservatism elected Donald Trump. It means ignorance did. I think Bruni goes off the mark here. I really do. Not only that, but higher education solutions to the problem is to turn higher education from a place that indoctrinates students into becoming liberals as to a place that on an equal basis indoctrinates people to become conservatives. I would suggest in both of those cases, you are indoctrinating students, you are not educating them. The missing element here is education. What you are doing is teaching people what to believe and what truth is. If you educate people, you are giving them the tools they need to educate themselves. Our higher education institutions aren't doing that. If we're indoctrinating students, the answer to that is not to indoctrinate them the other way. The answer is to educate them so that they themselves are equipped to recognize spin, to see indoctrination for what it is, to see mind control what it is, and deal with it accordingly. That's an educated population. That's an educated citizenry. That's an informed citizenry. An uneducated, ignorant citizenry is a citizenry that is easily manipulated, that is easily brainwashed by a positive or successful argument. In ancient Greece, that's what the Stoics argued, that education, the educated, need to be trained or educated in elocution, in the ability to make a good argument, because what you're trying to do is persuade the stupid or the ignorant. I would suggest it's giving these people who elected Donald Trump the benefit of the doubt to call them conservatives. They aren't informed enough to be called conservatives. It seems to me the answer is to begin educating students and giving them the tools they need to know spin when they see it, to separate fact from fiction, data, hard data, truth from spin. I would suggest to you that there's an unfortunate situation, of reality about that. And that is that liberals and conservative both are afraid to do that. The one thing that conservatives and liberals have in common is they don't trust the masses of people to be educated. They rationalize not educating them by convincing themselves that they're incapable of handling a quality education. I would argue that the real story is not that the masses of people are incapable. It's the fact that those who are in control are afraid of an educated electorate. They are really afraid. Which means that we as a society have never made the decision to really educate our people and give them what they need to become thinking, functioning, independent, intelligent human beings. We continue to deny 2/3 of our population access to that kind of education. And I think Donald Trump, the election of Donald Trump, is the result. I think as we complete our week together here in the virtual center, that might be a good place to end it. Recognition and appreciation of the fact that Donald Trump is a just result for the failures of a society that claims to educate but is frightened and afraid to do it. Afraid that with education comes a loss of the ability to manipulate, persuade, and control. Maybe our whole political system is driven by manipulating the masses in one direction or the other. Think of what we would be dealing with if we were dealing with a society in which our citizenry, our citizens, were truly educated, were truly informed, were truly capable of making intelligent, informed decisions. Wow. I don't think in our lifetimes we'll see it. I'd like to think we can at least begin to anticipate the beginnings of it. With that, I think we've pretty much reached the end of our program week here on the Virtual Center. Once again, I'd like to thank Bob Kincaid and Agnes and those folks at Head On Radio Network for allowing me and the Virtual Center to stay on the air. I hope that you find these programs worthwhile and beneficial. I'm operating on the assumption that they are. I move from one program to the other on the assumption that we're headed in a direction that people want. I hope, in fact, I trust, I have faith that that is true. I also believe that I'm trying to do the very best I can to make these programs worth your time. I respect and value the importance of your time. I don't ask you to give it up lightly. So again, thank you so very much. Thanks to Bob and Agnes and the folks at Head On. And thank you for your continued support of this network, of Bob Kincaid and Agnes, of the Virtual Center. I hope you have a great rest of the day and a wonderful week and weekend. Don't forget that daylight savings begins this weekend. We turn our clocks back 1 hour on Saturday night. For the folks at Head On, this is Bill O'Brien thanking you very, very much for your time. Be kind to each other. And finally, once again, thank you.